Hello, NPN. My name is Salome Asega. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, also known as Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I'm an artist, director of New Ink, an art design and technology incubator at the New Museum, and most importantly, a very proud NPN board member. I'm beyond thrilled to hold virtual space with you all this week and to also introduce our next session, Are You for Sale? As part of NPN's commitment to systems change in our fields, we've been exploring what building artist power looks like, not just through programs, but in the larger context of re-envisioning philanthropic structures, resource distribution, advocating for policy that ensures artists' basic human needs are met, among many other things. Exploring the ethical entanglements between money and art making, the three artists in this session will talk together about dreaming outside of our current philanthropic structures, envision creative economies that help build artists' power. This session asks, are we too afraid of losing what little we have? What are the effects of a scarcity mentality, and can we change the systems at play to manifest abundance? Let's welcome to the virtual stage performance artist and creator of the Are You for Sale podcast, Miguel Gutierrez, co-director of the Bridge Project, Mohr, and poet, curator, and performance artist Jaamil Olawale Kosoko. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miguel Gutierrez. Thanks for joining us today for this plenary discussion called Are You for Sale, which is also the name of a podcast that I've been releasing since last year, which focuses on the ethical entanglement between art and money. I'm really excited for today's conversation. I invited two amazing, wonderful colleagues to talk with me about these issues that have come up in the podcast, but more specifically, a future-looking conversation about what we can do in terms of how we think about money and art. So I'll introduce myself. I'm a dance artist. I'm based in the Lenape hooking area, in an area that is currently referred to as Brooklyn, but I'm joining you today from Muwekma, Ohlone, and Ramaytush lands in an area currently referred to as San Francisco. And I'm a 50-year-old light-skinned Latinx daddy bear wearing a mustard shirt and my clear-rimmed glasses and my salt and pepper hair. So why don't we go around and each introduce ourselves, starting with you, Jaamil.
Beautiful. Thank you, Miguel. My name is Jaamil Olawale Kosoko. I'm an interdisciplinary artist working primarily within the modalities of dance and creative facilitation, education, and I am coming to you from the Lenape, the land of the Lenape. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for this invitation. Yeah.
Thanks, Jaamil. Hope.
Hi, thanks Miguel for the invitation. My name is Hope Mohr. I'm a cultural worker and an attorney working at the intersection of the arts and social change. I'm white, queer, able-bodied, and cis female. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm zooming in from Ramaytush Ohlone territory, otherwise known as San Francisco. And I want to acknowledge that I'm here, and the wisdom that I am sharing today is indebted to all the artists and activists that I work with, especially my colleagues, Sherry Hill and Carla Quintero. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Hope. I really appreciate all that. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you guys. I'm going to just kind of read a little introduction here to kind of set the stage for where I'm coming from in this conversation. So last year, as I said, with the assistance of my managing producer and artist manager, Michelle Fletcher, I began releasing episodes of a podcast called Are You for Sale, which looks at the ethical entanglements between funding and dance making. I was inspired to make this podcast when back in 2018, I applied to several grants to support my piece, This Bridge Called My Ass, and was rejected by nearly all of them, except for NPN. So thank you, NPN. After I got over my bruised ego, and it's entirely possible that I have not, I started to think about the system, the funding world, that I had so desperately sought approval from for so many years, and in which I had gotten pretty successful at navigating. I thought about what I had given up in myself and in my work in order to be good at the game. So I decided to learn more about the history of the game itself. I read Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance, which talks a bit about the history of philanthropy, its roots in settler colonialism, and how it perpetuates income inequality in this country. I learned about the history of public funding from the New Deal through the National Endowment for the Arts, and I spoke and continue to speak with many artists in the area that we refer to as the United States and abroad about their experiences with funding their work. I've also spoken with scholars and funders on these topics. The podcast has provided an outlet for me to discuss my history with funding and the history about funding that I've learned. But more to the point, the podcast has been a way for me to empower other artists with information. I want for us all to understand that the conditions we encounter as artists have a history and a context and are not inevitable. There are other models. For me, some of the guiding questions have been, how do you negotiate the inescapable fucked upness of money with the life-saving and life-affirming desire to make art and the ethical imperative to pay others who work for you? So obviously you can go to areyouforsalepodcast.com to listen to the episodes we've put out so far. My research in this arena coincides with a field-wide reckoning about equity, racial justice, and strategies for decolonizing our systems of presenting, funding, and art making. It has been widely noted that the pandemic brought into undeniable view the starkness of the economic precarity that dance artists and all cultural workers face. Over the last few years, there have been multiple initiatives to assist artists in unprecedented ways. I'm thinking about the Ford Foundation's Disability Future Fellows program, which awarded 20 artists with $40,000 fellowships. Specific to the pandemic, there was the $5,000 Artist Relief Grant. That was a collaborative effort by Academy of American Poets, Artadia, Creative Capital, Foundation for Contemporary Arts, MAP Fund, Young Arts, United States Artists, with seed funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and then the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. 4,682 artists received that grant between April 2020 and June 2021. In New York, Dance NYC awarded a total of $1,500,000 through the Coronavirus Dance Relief Fund from March to September 2020, with 1,082 grants of $500 to freelance dance workers, totaling $541,000 with 734 unique recipients. And these are just a few examples. But funding of dance projects largely continues, I believe, as an inherently exclusionary practice of meritocracy. Many people apply for resources that only a few people receive, as determined by a select group of people adhering to abstract notions of quality or excellence. As Mohr Brennan, executive director of MAP, said in a recent interview I did with her for an upcoming episode focused on funders, she says, quote, I've come to this place, this is maybe a pretty provocative thing to say, but where I see arts philanthropy in particular as a model of oppression in a certain way, because it is framed as a contest, and those who are not receiving those funds have to bear the emotional, psychological weight of what that means, right? I mean, that's literally how oppression operates, right? End quote. In today's conversation with Jaamil and Hope, I want to think about what new models might look like. I want to offer fantastical visions and pragmatic real-world examples of how change happens. So that's my little intro. I want to just kind of start off asking you both, when you first became aware of how money interacted with your dance practice. And Hope, why don't we start with you?
Okay. In theory, I don't think you should need to be paid to feel like an artist, but that aspiration doesn't line up with my experience. I have vivid memories of the first check I got for performing in the Nutcracker when I was 8, and the first check that I got on contract with a big dance company, and the first grant that I got as a choreographer. And those moments felt deeply validating to the extent that I thought about framing those checks. And now that my work focuses increasingly on the politics of art making, I can't think about dance without thinking about money. And I spend most of my time thinking about money, how to raise it, how it should be ethically allocated, and thinking about budgets as moral documents. So money has always been inextricably intertwined with dance for me.
Thank you. It's amazing. I love that you got checks for the Nutcracker. I want to see that frame just because I've never heard of that in my life. Jaamil, how about you?
Yeah, I mean it's the same. Although I never got my Nutcracker check, but I still I think about the first time, yeah, I did get paid, and I started. I started immediately after college, and I remember asking a choreographer friend, like, am I a professional now? Like, how do I know? And they basically were like, well, are you getting paid to do what you do? And I was like, yeah, I guess I am. So, and so it was this way that I feel like I was learning really by doing on the ground. I'm so incredibly grateful that early on in my career, I spent many of those years in Philadelphia. And at the time, between like 2005 and 2010, the funding in Philly was incredible, and so it was really a great time to be coming up as an emerging artist. Those funds began to dwindle, and I could see that from a distance, and I could see how that would begin to impact me, because these funding letters, they go out to the entire community, so you see pretty immediately, are the artists that I'm working for getting funding? Oh, this is going to be a dry year. Like I mean, I would look at those funding letters almost as a kind of way of acknowledging, what my financial future would really be like, essentially. Because I was focusing on performing, and really that was my life, that was my bread and butter early on. I would come to learn that that is not the most sustainable way to position oneself, and as a result of a dried landscape, a dried up funding landscape, I began to transition into curation and arts management, just to begin to get those skills, so that at least I would have something to sort of fall on should the performance work not, really pan out as I had hoped. So I really came into this game understanding that, one, it was pretty fickle. Sometimes it can feel like a popularity contest, and that I should have very little to no expectation around consistently being supported or funded for my creative endeavors. I feel like I knew that early on, and as a result, I've been going about sort of figuring out alternative ways to, to kind of get the work made and position it in a way that, feels spiritually revelatory, while also attempting to continue to support myself,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jaamil, I'll just make a note that your mic is like rubbing up against your shirt a bit. If
Oh,
there's any way for you to go forward. Yeah, just
yeah.
thank you. Thank you. I
I'll
really
hold
appreciate
it. Thank you. There's no way to know these things.
it.
I
I
don't
know.
know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, these two answers for me. The one idea of like the inevitability of that relationship being so tethered together, and then I think, Jaamil, you're speaking to this kind of like the BTS, the behind the scenes, getting the skills. I suddenly was reminded of this interview I did once with Steve Paxton for a dance based project platform many years ago, and it was just like over email, this back and forth over several emails, and he mentioned in the early 60s like dancing for someone for months at a time, and then changing the whole piece the right before the show, and all of this like being unpaid work, and he wasn't complaining about it. He was like, can you imagine? And I was like, no, I cannot imagine. And I think that a lot of us are sort of inculcated into this belief system that somehow that romance should still somehow be woven into the way that we
Mm,
think about what we do. And so there's, at least for a lot of US based artists, there is this like coming to Jesus moment of like, wait, money, like how am I going to think about money? And I feel similarly to you, Hope, that I cannot extract the two things.
mhm,
um and I feel similarly to you, Jaamil, that like I've done a lot of work to figure it out, how this all functions.
mhm,
And I guess just like a kind of follow-up question is what drives you in that? What has driven you into that? And then I think I'll get more specific about this with you individually, but I'm curious because I think at some point, from my perspective, it seems like not only has money come into the equation, but something about justice
mhm.
also has come into the equation. So I'm curious to hear for both of you when that wove into the picture, or was that always there? Maybe Hope, do you have a thought?
I mean, it's. I guess I couldn't really begin to even think about justice until around, justice as it pertains to funding, until I actually had some support to to think around how does distribution work, and how am I compensating my team members, and what does reciprocity look like, and yeah, just all of these sort of deeper questions. I mean, you ask about awareness. I think it's the questions that really keep us moving and pushing forward. It's the questions that led you to this podcast, to continue to open up these conversations, and to get other perspectives. And so in a lot of ways, I mean, to be completely honest, I feel my awareness is quite recent in regards to how money performs or activates in my life, because it's only really recently that I've been able to have, the support to really think around how am I working, and how am I sharing, the support that I get and the resources that I receive, and I have to continue to tell funders and institutions, because I know I look like an individual artist, and I am an independent individual artist, but the reality is that there are communities of people that I also support, pretty directly, and so yeah, I feel like in a lot of ways. There's just I become like this funnel, and I don't mind it, because again, I early on, I understood that the funds that I receive should go to making the work and not to me and that's fine. I'm grateful to have an amazing partner who supports me, and you know, the love is real. So partnership, that's one thing. I if you can do that, that's been really life changing, as it pertains to how I'm able to show up and do this work and stay invested. Because I feel like if I did not have that personal support, to be completely honest, I might have given up a while ago.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up the fiction of the individual artist, which is a horrible term in the field because we've never been individuals, right?
Mm-mm.
Um, and then but I'll want to circle back a bit to this question of like funds going to the work and not to me, which is something that came up in my interview with Cynthia Oliver in the podcast where she mentioned how in the early days the funds that she received, she's like, oh, I wasn't getting paid, and of course, she's like, as if it was like a very natural thought for it not to be the case, where I was like, but why did we think that is a natural expectation? But Hope,
Yeah.
I wonder what you if you would what you wanted to say.
Yeah, I feel like this narrative that we're artists for the love of it undercuts our capacity for self advocacy and also
Mm.
undercuts our capacity for collective action. So I feel like over time, I've had to expand my idea of what creative practice means and what it means to be a dancer to include activism as a form of creative practice. I feel like for a long
Yes.
time, I was operating on this kind of binary assumption that I was an activist in one area of my life, and in another area of my life, I was a dancer. But over time, I think the work for me has been to get rid of that binary and to, expand my idea of what it means to be a dancer to include activism and advocacy.
Yeah, so that's a good tie-in. I'm actually going to kind of follow up, like, so in case you don't know it, people, Hope has written an amazing book. I have it right here. Shifting Cultural Power: Case Studies and Questions in Performance.
Mm.
Um, and I don't know if I'm going to easily summarize this book, but you talk about your own trajectory and your path as an artist and as a cultural worker and as a curator, and how social justice comes into your thinking, and how dismantling white supremacy in yourself and in your organization plays out. And it's very honest and very like rigorous accountability going on. And there is that moment in the book where you talk about how a board member was like, I miss seeing your choreographic work, or like, now it has to be like about like social justice. And you're like, what if my choreographic work is about social justice now, right? So this really interesting sort of reframing for yourself of of exactly what you just said, breaking down that binarism. And I want to acknowledge that I know you as someone who first met you as a dancer for Trisha Brown. And during that time, I found out that you had gone to law school, which I was like, wait, what? Okay. And then you have been incredibly generous to me as an artist, bringing me out to the Bay Area to teach. And then you sought many venues for the possibility of partnering to bring This Bridge Called My Ass, which is amazing. And, you know, I I've seen you kind of in these different phases, and so I'm, one of the things you say in your book, when you're talking about shifting cultural power, you say, but writing checks to artists of color does not shift cultural power. The re-granting paradigm allows existing white-led organizations to maintain control over resources and relationships with funders. And so I'm curious for you to discuss what you have seen as successful shifts of cultural power, either or both, in your own organizational development, and then maybe something you see in the field.
Mhm. In terms of the field, I feel like we are seeing real shifts in narratives about quote excellence that have rationalized inequity for so long. And as that narrative shift happen, I feel like practices also happen. So we're seeing foundations like Hewlett, Sunset, historically white organizations off their roster to make space for other organizations in furtherance of their newly articulated equity-driven funding strategies. And I feel like COVID has accelerated those shifts by showing that it is possible to fund artists based on things other than, quote, merit. In response to COVID, I've seen funders shift from project-based support to general operating support, to triaging applicants based on sheer financial need, not asking for work samples, lotteries. Likewise, there are experiments with UBI, Universal Basic Income inspired models, like YBCA currently has a pilot program around guaranteed artist income happening. Again, an approach that's not based on merit, but on the premise that artists are workers. So I see that as a really significant shift. I'm also seeing shifts in the realm of contracting, the agreements that artists make around the terms of production. And these conversations are showing us that it is possible to reframe art production in terms of relationship and not transaction. So an example of that is a contract that instead of paying an artist a lump sum after the show, you schedule multiple payments throughout the life of the engagement. And in doing so, you value the invisible labor of the artist throughout the creative process, and you also decentralize the performance product. So I see those shifts are happening. And then in terms of my own work, I can talk briefly about that. The nonprofit dance org that I founded 15 years ago, we've implemented a model of equity-driven distributed leadership. So we've shifted from a white founder-led hierarchy to a multiracial co-directorship. And we implemented pay equality across the organization. So everyone, dancers, co-directors, we all make the same hourly starting salary. We have a paid artist curatorial council that has control over 30% of our budget. Our board has transitioned to a 100% working artist board. And I'm stepping off the board this month, so that, quote, founder seat is now becoming a rotating staff position. And in parallel with those structural changes has been kind of the deeper personal and interpersonal work of changing how work actually gets done. So shifting from a culture of efficiency to one of democracy. And I say this not to like toot our own horn, but just to say that these changes are possible. Yeah.
Thanks, Hope. I mean, you want to get the details, go to Hope. You want to get out of the like, what should we do thing, then I'm like, and here it is. There's a freaking book. Yeah, I mean, and I know, of course, I want to acknowledge that many people have been talking about these issues for a long time, and I know other plenary discussions at the NPN conference will address this, particularly the Creating New Futures folks and their incredible documents, notes on equitable funding. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and questions but I want to kind of like save, but I was just writing down all these things. I mean, this last thing of the Artist Advisory Council both being paid and then also holding 30% of the power of the budget is fascinating to me. And then stepping off the board itself, because I think it's interesting. I remember I'm not incorporated, but when I was talking to a consultant about that possibility, I remember him being very like, and make yourself the president of the board, and I was kind of like, okay, like, like I was like, I don't even know what that means. But there's sort of, and this comes up for me a lot in reading your book and thinking about what you're working through is about like what it literally means to sort of release your own power from the equation. So that's just been very fascinating to me to learn through your work. Jaamil, I have also known you in many capacities for many years. I know you first as like a person who was dancing in Philly for lots of friends of mine. And you briefly were in a project. Well, you were in a project that was very short of mine in 2010. You've written books of poetry. You worked in administration at NYLA. I still have a memory of you like wearing a little mic thing in the lobby one time when I came for a talk. You went to ICPP, the Institute for Curatorial Practice and Performance, and you've been dedicating yourself to your choreographic and performance work. And I think that knowing that you've had that kind of trajectory through the admin, that you have landed in what I see as like being such a visible critical figure and the advancement of a radical Black queer aesthetic and politic is really intriguing to me. Like I don't want to draw too broad a stroke here, but often it is the case that artists kind of seem to kind of end up more in the administration realm of things. And my sense, again, this may be just my perspective, has been that you've kind of been like, yeah, no, I'm just going to get weirder.
Exactly. I will not be contained.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of curious, like, has that been a conscious navigation in the sense of where you are now? But you obviously are still in relationship to institution. So
Totally.
how are you holding those different identities and knowledges together?
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in a very hyphenated reality now. I mean, we always have, whether we acknowledged it or not. But I've always felt a multiplicity, and I think it's showing itself, now in not only my creative expression, but also, my expressions of gender and, my expressions of loving and how I engage with community. It's all sort of intertwined in that way. It's amazing to hear the incredible work that Hope has done, with her company and just the work around it. I think, wow, I don't even know if I could not have ever, I mean, maybe I could have, but even creating such structures, that just that idea for me, I'm like, what would that mean? Because the way that I operate now, I feel like I am a member of a community, of artists and thinkers and dramaturgs, if you will. And we all sort of, collaborate on projects, but it's, there's a kind of research component, there's a critical thinking and sort of creative component, this sort of creative administration. But all of these are aspects of, for me, just what it means to be, worlding and creating possibilities and attempting to, just put forth new ideas and possibilities for what, it means to be a radical queer Black, what you call me, Miguel? You say I was like, yes, thank you for that. I want to be all of those things. I am all of those things. I own all of those things. I am all of those things. But thank you so much for just acknowledging that trajectory, because I think it was very conscious, but I also, I was improvising the whole time. I think of my life as a kind of, certainly as a kind of choreography, if you will. And inside of that choreography, has meant maneuvering, and sort of finding slippages and in betweens that I can infiltrate, and cracks in the system that will let me in. You know, and I think I also just have to acknowledge that, yeah, I don't know if I would have been able to even hold that radical queer presence that you named so beautifully, had it not been for my kind of entree through the European circuit, because I feel like I really, like Europe put me on before the US really put me on. And I think it's kind of having had to go through, those gates, yeah, that I've been able to sort of land and do the work that I do in the States. But that was, and that surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. There's no way that you can, like say, hey, Europe, put me on your stages. You know what I mean? Like, I still don't know quite how that happened, to be completely honest, but I'm happy it did. And it's allowed me to kind of land inside of the landscape the way I have, the way I am now. So I'm really grateful for that whole circuit over there, because it really has allowed me to be able to, continue to pay my bills and pay collaborators and all of that. So it's another income stream. And I guess this is something that I want to speak to, which is how we go about educating ourselves, as artists. We have to empower ourselves financially. We have to, become financially literate. And I know it's like, who wants to do that kind of thing? Like, do we have to go over the budget right now? But I mean, that's my approach. Like, do I have to go over the budget? But I know the critical importance of doing that, and doing it transparently, so that all my team members, we all sort of know across the board, what compensation is, and how we're expected to move forward together. And that's something that I try to be just really transparent about. Like, I'm working with this pot of money. Hey, let's do it, and I also try to allow enough flexibility for collaborators to come in and out as they need, because it's an emergent kind of improvisational form that I feel like I'm working through creatively, administratively, professionally, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing kind of two different sides of what feels somewhat similar,
Yeah.
but correct me if I'm wrong, which is, I feel like with Hope, what I'm hearing is kind of horizontalization, dispersal. It sounds like you bringing a lot of voices in to the mix, as a way of not eliminating yours, but to sort of put it in context, which I think for a lot of people rubs up against and I'll be honest, even for me, it rubs up a little bit against the kind of desire for ownership or authorship, of one's own vision or work. And that's something that definitely came up for me in reading your book. I was like, how do I feel about this? Like, would I be okay with this amount of dispersal? With you, Jaamil, I'm hearing kind of like the improvisation, the intuition, the like learning to not necessarily unlearn, but to sort of absorb and yet somehow still play. But I also appreciate you bringing in the context of coming in through a European presenting market, which I have some experience with. And one of the things that is afforded to artists in that market is a sense of just, I don't know about agency, but at least the sense of value that like what you do is legit.
Exactly.
There isn't this kind of like conversation around whether what you do is valuable in culture or meaningful, or it's like a side hustle. It's allowed to be central to the identity of the person, therefore centralizing to that person,
So and you're also treated better. I'm just gonna say that. I hope that's okay.
Yes.
But it's just I was treated so much better.
What does better look like?
It looks like, being paid on time. It looks like having, good hospitality and time to really settle, it looks like not having to do a whole lot of back and forth around negotiation. I mean, they're like, hey, we're interested in this. And I know it's not always the case, but generally, it's like, hey, I'm interested in your work. How much is it? You're like, hey, great, it's this amount. They're like, hey, okay, when can we do it? And then we're moving on, in the US, it's like, oh, do I know you? Do I like you? Have we it's just like this whole other level of romance or something that you have to engage in. Forgive me, but it feels like this like seduction or something that you have to go through in order to get a gig sometimes. And again, a popularity contest. And I know that resources, there's this idea or this language that, oh, there's only so few resources. But I swear, even inside of this COVID reality, when all of this funding was being pushed out and only certain individuals were able to have access to it or whatever it was, but I remember getting a note from a funder, and they were like, yeah, we can give out, I think we're going to give out 25 awards. We've 50 have been nominated. We're only giving out 25. And I'm like, why can't we just give everyone, like, all of these people deserve the support. Why can't we just give this money to everyone in that's been, that's been nominated? So there is this way that, going back to the map example, but that this the funding mechanism, it reiterates this oppressive way of doing the work, and it perpetuates a scarcity mentality in the mind of the artists, so that you're being socialized to believe that you're always indebted, that you're always having to beg, that you're always reaching for a handout, and that there's not enough to go around. And that really is it's false. It's not true.
Sure.
In my opinion.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I'm thinking about your distributing leadership strategies that you talk about in the book, and how you have radically restructured your own organization. Something that comes up for me, and maybe other people will wonder this as well, which is, there's already, I feel like, a kind of tendency in the United States artist organizations for artists to do administrative work, right? Like most US organizations, dance presenting organizations, the staff often is young dancers or dance artists. I couldn't help but wonder, that was very Sarah Jessica Parker, Sex and the City. I couldn't help but wonder,
just like that.
And just like that. How are you thinking about what it means for dance artists to have to take on those kinds of roles, and within an organization? Let's say, there's one thing to talk about a presenting organization, but like within an artist's organization, and then what do we think about that? What does that mean in a funding organization? What does that look like there?
I mean, not all artists want to do that kind of work.
Yeah.
But I think of it as, like, shifting power requires more than just offering one-off opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
It really requires bringing artists to the table to have a meaningful power over resources and decisions. And if we're really committed to that, then with that work, will come admin work, will come looking at the budget. And I feel like, given the realities of our system here in the US, I feel like if artists are going to have power in the field, they're going to need to be willing to take on some of that kind of nitty gritty work of governance, of decision making. So I don't know if that's answering your question.
No, I hear that from the artist perspective. I mean, I think that, to follow up to that is sort of, if you can say even more about how you feel like that doesn't necessarily compromise the artistic practice or vision.
You mean just in terms of sheer hours in the day?
I mean, however you think about it, I'm curious, how has that come up for you?
Yeah. I would say definitely, as I've moved back in the organization, less of my work is what I would call kind of studio practice or sheer creative practice. I deal a lot more from in the background with keeping the ship running and doing bank reconciliations and things like that. So I do feel like, yeah, there has been a shift in my practice, but I feel like I feel a real moral imperative, to state the obvious. I am white, and I feel like white people need to give up power for things to change. It's not enough to just kind of wiggle around and kind of adapt the organization cosmetically. Because racism is structural, if the changes aren't deep, the institution will just kind of retrench and shapeshift, and the power won't really shift. And I do feel like personally that kind of transformation is a kind of grief work.
That's the truth.
I feel like white people, and I've had to do that work and will continue to do that work, but there are losses, but I feel like there are also gains in terms of how we can move together and what's possible. So yeah, I don't know if that speaks to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really curious. I mean, I'm very fascinated by the idea of this grief work. But I guess the last component would be just what would you say to funding bodies in relationship to these ideas of distributing leadership? Like what are the ways that you think that those organizations can engage this kind of work?
Well, as much as possible, having artists be integrally involved in designing the evaluation process, so that it's not just a small group of quote experts behind closed doors. The process is super transparent, and yeah, I would say just bringing more people to the table, having it be more transparent.
Yeah, I think that something that has come up for me in talking to funders, two things that have come up for me. One is the fact that I've never been invited to the board meetings, right? Like, so I've been very grateful to be the recipient of a lot of the largesse of these organizations and their different programs, but I've never been like a decision maker of any of those kind of programs. And it does come up to this question for me a little bit about like what level of fluency do I even want to gain, to like sit at a table with a hedge fund manager, or the president of a museum. It's like, I don't know that I want to hang out with those people, honestly, like, and I don't know if they want to hang out with me, or if they do, they'll just think that they're like slumming and whatever, getting some like cool cred by hanging out with the weirdo artist. I mean, just to say it, like I feel like part of the design of my life has been to sort of stay out of certain rooms, and to continue to pull into the room that I'm in, the people that I want to interact with. So I feel a bit caught in that question. And this something in what you're talking about, Hope, for me, the word that's like the word that's coming up for me is imagination. Where then does the space for imagination express itself, or like how is it expressing itself? And if we think of part of what our survival is depending on is our creative practices, what does that look like when our creative practices shift so radically to not just accommodate, as you said, a consciousness of racial justice or social justice or inequity, but to completely repattern ourselves within the context of how this work that is being done needs to happen kind of globally, nationally. Yeah, I don't know what my question is, but I just wanted to say that to you and wondered if you have any thought about what I just said.
Well, I feel like philanthropy has been mired in this kind of charitable framework. I'm really interested in how that could be shifted. The solidarity economy has this mantra: solidarity, not charity. So what happens if funders, instead of thinking of, they're distributing checks from on high in this very colonial relationship. It's more about aligning with social movements, or presenters. It's not about advancing your career as a presenter or advance or protecting the organization's bottom line, but you're aligning yourself with something that's much bigger than your operating context. And how does that change, quote, in community investment strategies, so that the wealth isn't just kind of flying in, dumping a check and leaving, but how can you really root wealth locally and in a way that it stays with the artists? And I think that requires bringing artists to the table in terms of giving them real power in the decisions.
Yeah. I mean, just one last thing I'll say about that is something that's interesting to me to think about is how a lot of the large funding bodies now that whose money makes its way to dance, right? Mellon, Ford, Doris-Duke are run by people of color. I mean, I don't know actually if the new president of Doris-Duke identifies as a person of color, but he, in his name, Samshur Gill, Singh Gill, I get the sense that he has these Southeast Asian roots, and so yeah, it's a curious moment. Elizabeth Alexander at Mellon, Darren Walker at Ford. It's a question for me about what it is to have these people in those positions, and does the position inherently mean that there are things that you just won't ever be able to do, regardless of who you individually are and what your ethics or politics might be. And yeah,
what do you mean when you say that it'll impact on who you are?
I think it's kind of like does the structure shape the outcome, to begin with, right? Like, is there a way for the Mellon Foundation to completely dismantle itself in an effective way to redistribute leadership, or what does decolonize? I mean, I hate using the word decolonizing because I really strongly believe decolonization is not a metaphor. Thank you, Eve Tuck. But it's there. I feel like there is energy at these large organizations around these desires, and yet they still exist. They still have their offices in like really nice places. We're still not invited to the board meetings, at least as far as I know. Maybe you have been. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just kind of wondering about what is it going to actually take for this thing to shift, and what can the role of artists be in that shift? I don't know, Jaamil, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about your question, and I'm like, I'm really asking myself, how much of a pessimist am I? Is this something that can shift, like at its core? Is it even possible? Or is it just an illusion of a shift? Yeah, these are just some of the questions that because I think of just the insidious nature upon which this nation is built, and so like undoing, centuries of, I mean, it's so much harm. I don't know how you I don't know how you I mean, yeah, I don't know how you undo that. Yeah, so I'm really struggling. But again, there is this idea of the imagination, and I do believe that if anyone will do the change or be the change, it will happen inside of the creative sector, and inside of art and culture. I do believe that, like, we know we can't depend on governments to do much in that regard. So, but yeah, it's a really hard spot. I feel like it's a question. Yeah, it's a question for me. I want to be optimistic, but I don't know.
Miguel, what are your when you think about like the idea of really changing the way funding decisions are structured, and maybe bringing artists more into that equation. What do you feel like are the barriers to that? Or
I mean, I think it's a little bit like I said, it's a bit about there are reasons why I don't have certain jobs. You know, like I could have pursued, you know, I think I'm a fairly intelligent person. I could have pursued a lot of careers. There was at the same time, art and art making and being weird in public, you know, felt just inevitable to me. Like it felt like this is the thing I'm on the planet to do. And that also includes this kind of work. That also, you know, includes reaching out and collaborating and bringing people together. And, you know, there are many manifestations to the work. I think when I talk to funders, what strikes me is that they actually are quite aware of the problem of the system, and yet they have done some sort of negotiation with themselves. And I'm not indicting them for this, because we all live in hypocrisy every day in some form or another. We're all walking on stolen land. We're all walking on the bones of very oppressed peoples. But there's this kind of negotiation that they've made with themselves to stay at their jobs, or to, you know, fulfill the demands of the organization in some way. And I'm really fascinated about that line, that decision you make to be like, yes, I will agree, or not like, no, I completely disagree, because we all have to make a living. But what holds that line in place, and how that line is moving, and what the moral conundrums are that are coming up. You know, from a very pragmatic point of view, you know, there's just things like the legally changing the distribution, you know, the minimum distribution amount, the percentage, right? These kind of things that you could do from a legal perspective to demand that these organizations don't exist in perpetuity, that they have to pay out their corpuses at a certain amount of time, that there isn't some illusion of unlimited growth, which is what the entire financial system is sort of based on and dependent upon. The notion that growth will just continue, and wealth will continue to accumulate. But look how great it is that we're giving out this wealth that endlessly accumulates, because it's living in stock markets that are doing all kinds of extractive things all over the world. You know, for me, it's like I'm just like, I don't, you know, there's more money. Like there just is more money. One, you know, this is obvious, but I do see a role for government in this, in terms of regulation. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation about taxation of billionaires. You know, the question of whether billionaires should even exist, right? So, for me, it's a. I don't deny that artists should play a role in this conversation, but there's a part of me that's like, I don't want to talk to those people.
Yeah,
they've made their decisions, and I want to talk. You know, I mean, I love talking to you guys, and I love getting into the wonkiness of it, obviously. But does that make sense? You know, like there's something about the willful. It's not, for me, I don't think it's about me being blind to something, or excuse me, it's a better metaphor, me ignoring something, because I know the information and I'm willing to learn it. I'm not scared of money. I'm not scared of looking at a budget. And the podcast has definitely showed me that. And yet I still come out of it a little being like, I just want to make weird shit.
yeah. I mean, there's a compromise. What I'm hearing, like, you know, like how much of an ethical compromise or spiritual compromise are we willing, you know, to make? And I think also we have to acknowledge that money is deeply emotional. You know, we all have a kind of, you know, history or lack thereof with it. And so, when you're told from a young age, you know, yeah, just when you receive all of these ideas early on, they impact how you relate and how you work with a thing, you know. And so I know for myself, I'm having to do a lot of of undoing and reimagining simultaneously, like changing of a kind of paradigm shift is having to occur. I'm thinking about this deeply and emotionally, but I also understand that I have a history, an emotional history of poverty or the lack thereof, and I know that deeply impacts how I work with money and how I redistribute it and all of these things. Yeah.
Hope, did you want to say something as well?
I'm just sitting with this tension between, in terms of a theory of change, like incrementalism versus like transformative.
Mm.
I don't think it's an either or. I think we need both. But in terms of funders, like the Creating New Futures doc has so many great recommendations for incremental strategies, things that basically will make it easier for artists to get money, like reduce the barriers to eligibility, make applications simpler, make program officers more approachable, all of those things. If we were to make it really easy for artists to get money, I think that would be significant. It would kind of turn down the heat on this kind of climate of popularity competition, which is so oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
If those gates to entry disappeared, I wonder, if every foundation program officer was super committed to making the money as easy as possible to get. I think that could be huge, as well as like on the the regulation side, like forcing foundations to cough up a larger percentage of their corpus. I think those two things in tandem could be pretty powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, and I'll say, like I mentioned, Artist Relief Fund at the beginning, and I remember when that came out, and I mentioned this, I think, in the first the interview I did at the kind of beginning of this whole process, which also you had you were the host for that, or the Bridge Project was the host for that, in my interview with Edgar Villanueva. But when the Artist Relief Fund came out in the spring of 2020, I was like, why haven't these organizations been doing this the whole time? And when I spoke with MAP people from MAP Fund, Lauren Sloan and Mohr Brennan, and Lauren mentioned, like, yeah, there was like this daily phone call and talking, and she was like, up until now, that's not something I have done. We haven't been in communication with other funding organizations, which was very honest. And I was also a bit shocked. I was like, really? Because I feel like I'm talking to artists all the time about, like, I mean, she talks a lot to artists. I think that's where her focus has been, not necessarily looking across her own field, but looking more to the dance artists, which is because she's also a dance artist. So I don't know, it's just interesting to me to think about how these organizations can work. We're talking about working collaboratively in our own communities and in our organizations, and what about putting the onus on those organizations also to think collaboratively to solve the problems, so that artists don't have to keep writing these rants these ranty letters and manifesti type art documents.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the field has for so long asked artists to do all of the heavy lifting. The burden has to be on presenters and funders to self-educate and hold themselves accountable. There's so much work to be done on intersectionality riders and accessibility riders, and the artists should not have to be drafting those
themselves. Exactly.
Ourselves.
Yeah, ourselves. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, Hope. No, please. I just, that struck, because here I am, like what's a health and safety? I'm creating these riders so that I and my team and those that hopefully come after me are able to infiltrate and be in some of these spaces, a bit easier. But that it can be really taxing, and so I don't want to not speak to the deep work that is already happening, that artists are so committed to and are doing, Yeah, because I know it's happening and I see it happening. We all know it's happening. Uh, I still question, are the are do the people who need to hear it, are they hearing it? Are they really hearing it, and are they willing and able to make the shifts that is needed for the change that we want to occur? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit what I was trying to name before. Like we silo ourselves on purpose. There's a reason a person ends up in a certain position.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, I mean, it's but I feel so. Yeah, I would also say like, no more surveys. Like the surveys have all been made. Can we have like no more surveys, no more committees? Just give out the money. Like come on. I want to make a
I think a
T-shirt.
lot of organizations are saying, well, we can make the change, but we need more data, or
Ah,
we need a strategic plan. And I feel like the gift of COVID is that it shows us that some change can be super fast and it can be super emergent, and you don't need a fucking strategic plan.
no, and that's always been a delaying strategy anyway. I mean, that's definitely very true. If you look at the history of the National Endowment for the Arts, whenever there was crisis, it was like, well, let's put a commission together, to like evaluate. And so it's yeah. Anyway, well, there were more questions I wanted to get to that we didn't get to, but we're sort of winding down now. And I want to at least leave a little space for us to sort of like, if you have any final thoughts or questions or anything that you feel like hasn't been said. Obviously, this is an ongoing conversation. This conversation does not stop. I really appreciated your confusion earlier, Jaamil, when you were like, it's a question. And I'm like, it's a question. All these things live in the realm of a perpetual question, but I wanted to know if you guys had any final things you want to make sure were said.
I want to hold I want to hold a space that you know there's something around how we, again, you opened with a question around the awareness of money. And again, I feel like I'm all, it's like every day I'm becoming more and more aware, and I'm learning a new thing, or I'm becoming more literate in something. And as a result, I become less, I guess, afraid or fearful of my engagement, with this thing called money, finance. But I also just want to say that, Miguel, I agree. I think, we have to, there are certain parameters that we've set so we can allow for us to do the work that we need to do. Um, and hope, I think it's important that we allow artists inside of these governing bodies, and to speak, but to speak and maintain a presence from the artistic creative perspective. That feels important to me. But again, I still I'm grappling with, the change that we want. Like, is it really able, like, are we just talking towards a thing, or or can there really be, this shift, this cultural shift that we're asking for? And I just don't know. I want to believe, I really do, but I don't know. But I hope that with this podcast, Miguel, that you continue to teach us and share new strategies for making the change a reality.
Thank you. Oh,
Um, I'm just thinking of something that came up in Maggie Nelson's new book, where she talks about how freedom is not this like epiphany fireworks moment and then the work is over.
Mm,
That like daily, messy, long haul practice. And I really believe that. And I
yeah,
believe that real shift happens when we show up like that every day for each other.
yeah.
And so I feel like our power is in our relationships. And I feel like that we just, we need to practice and train and support each other. And I feel like good things will happen if we do that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Thank you. And I want to say that I think that both of you are examples of change. You both inspire me, and I think that not all change requires a press release or exists on a press release. It happens in that kind of interpersonal way that you're describing, Hope. And I think it also happens, both of you have spoken a lot in ways that reveal the level of reflection that you've both done about your work and about your place as artists. And I think for me, that level of continual engagement and imagining, and that is a manifestation of imagination for me. um it shows that the change is happening. We can't always feel the shift while we're in the midst of it,
Mm,
and we may not even see the ultimate shift in our lifetimes. So there's also that to consider. But I want to say thank you to both of you. I want to say thank you to NPN for hosting us and for hosting this conversation. Thank you to everybody who chose to tune in and listen. And my hope is that the conversations will continue beyond this, and in an honest way, in a transparent way, in a vulnerable way, in a way that accepts that we're still all learning about these topics and that they are emotional, as has been named. And I hope that you will support the work of Jaamil and Hope and the many people that are in their spheres. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Stay weird, stay blessed, not stressed.
Thank
exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.